Hello and welcome to this edition of the Vermont Report on Palestine, Israel. I'm Mark Hage. The scourging of Gaza reached new levels of bloodletting on Tuesday, March 18th, when Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, ordered more than 100 attacks across the Strip. They came during Sahur, the pre-dawn breakfast during the month of Ramadan, which means these attacks were calculated to inflict maximum casualties. More than 600 Palestinians, 200 of them being children, were killed on the first day alone. The death toll now stands at greater than 700, and the attacks are ongoing. Defense for Children International reported that the carnage on day one, March 18th, quote, was one of the largest one-day child death tolls in Gaza in history, end quote. An Australian medic, Muhammad Mustafa, reported this horrific scene from just one hospital. It was just mostly women and children, burned head to toe, limbs missing, heads missing. We've run out of all painkillers. 7 girls are getting their legs amputated without anesthesia. Palestinian journalist Hassan Shobat reported from Beit Lahia, the city is being, quote, completely destroyed. Massacres have been ongoing since dawn yesterday. The occupation army is raining down fire on civilian homes, targeting residential neighborhoods and lands with heavy artillery shelling. Beit Lahia is no longer a city. Everything is reduced to death, end quote. Now, Israel, to be clear, has violated the ceasefire routinely since January, killing Palestinians, refusing to withdraw soldiers, withholding food, medicine, and all forms of humanitarian aid, and delaying prisoner releases. The corporate media in the United States has largely ignored these chronic violations. And on March 18th, Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, warned the people of Gaza that they would suffer, quote, utter destruction and total devastation, end quote, if his boss, Netanyahu, did not get his way this time around. And an Israeli Air Force leaflet dropped over Gaza put a finer point on this. It read in part, the world map will not change if Gaza's people disappear. No one will notice you. No one will ask about you, end quote. Amos Harel, a respected Israeli military correspondent from the newspaper Haaretz, wrote, Israel knowingly violated the ceasefire agreement with Hamas with American approval, because it didn't want to fully meet the terms it had committed to 2 months ago, end quote. Our first report features a revealing interview with Daniel Levy, the president of the United States Middle East Project and a former Israeli peace negotiator. He states that what we are seeing in Gaza now, quote, is a categorical and consistent Israeli refusal to do what it is committed to doing within the agreed framework of the ceasefire, end quote. Levy then offers an analysis of the cold, self-serving political calculus that is driving Netanyahu's decisions and the genocidal crimes his army and Air Force are committing in Gaza. This interview was produced by the Big Picture podcast, sponsored by Middle East Eye. Here now is Daniel Levy.
It was shortly before the dawn prayer this morning in Gaza. Shortly before families woke up to have their meal, to pray and to start their fast for the 18th day of Ramadan. This was the moment when the ceasefire in Gaza was ruptured violently by the sound of Israeli airstrikes. They struck without warning, targeting makeshift displacement camps filled with children. At least 400 people have so far been killed. That includes at least 130 children. One of the bloodiest days in what has now widely been described as a genocide. Israel's government vows to continue escalating their military attacks, saying this is in response to Hamas's refusal to extend the ceasefire, which has been in place since January. But is this the real reason for this morning's attack? Or is there a much more cynical explanation, one tied simply to the political fate of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? To tell us more, we're joined by Daniel Levy, the president of the U.S. Middle East Project and a former Israeli peace negotiator. Daniel Levy, welcome to the show. I want to ask you to begin by describing your reaction to the news.
I think the timing was always a question. They weren't going to probably broadcast it in advance. The fact of this, I'm afraid, is unsurprising. This is the direction we've been going in. One thing I would say about the timing is, sure, element of surprise, but I think doing this at the time of Sahur, pre-dawn, time to eat during the month of Ramadan, I think that is in itself designed to further stir up tensions and passions. It's obviously killing people is the worst part of it, but the affront to religious sensitivities and sensibilities. What we have seen is a categorical and consistent Israeli refusal to actually do what it was committed to doing within the agreed framework. The framework for the ceasefire was on day 16. Negotiations were supposed to begin on phase 2, later phase 3. It says in the framework agreement that phase 2 includes the full Israeli military withdrawal, a full permanent ceasefire. Those negotiations never began in earnest because from the get-go, the Israeli government refuted the very terms of the agreement. On day 50, they were supposed to withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor. That never happened. Instead, alongside the refusal to enter into the negotiations according to the agreed framework, we had the reimposition of the siege on March 2nd, when they stopped the supplies going in. On March 12th, the cutting of electricity with the knock-on effect to water desalination, and overnight, the strike on Gaza. And I think there were things to do with the domestic Israeli political scene, the political crisis Israel was in until this morning. It's not gone away, but it's been knocked off the headlines with Netanyahu's intention to fire the head of the Shin Bet. He's clashed with the Attorney General. Of course, he no longer has to appear in court over the next few days in his personal corruption trial. But I think the main thing that's been going on is that Netanyahu was testing the water in terms of what was his wiggle room with the Trump administration. Could he do this? And this defining moment, which I think led to the greatest anxiety on Team Netanyahu, was when we not only heard about Special Hostage Envoy Adam Boehler's talks with Hamas, but when he came out and defended those talks. That was just over a week ago. And he took to Israeli TV to defend those talks. Told some hard home truths, by the way. But since then, we've seen everything flow in the opposite direction. We've seen the Americans directly strike the Houthis in Yemen, directly strike Yemen, threaten Iran. Witkoff turn around and say, I'm abandoning the negotiated framework, which I brought into being and I was a guarantor of, by saying, yep, Hamas, accept the Israeli proposals or not, back to the lies, back to the deceit, and the disavowing of the direct track to Hamas. That's when Netanyahu realized he was back in the boss's seat as the president of the superpower, and Netanyahu was back on top with Trump as his supplicant.
I want to ask you about Trump and what is happening with the Trump administration, because it feels very confusing. There is mixed messaging. You mentioned the talks with Hamas that happened almost seemingly behind Israel's back. But let's start with Netanyahu himself, because as you mentioned, there's a lot going on politically in Israel right now, and all of it revolves around one man, and that is the Prime Minister of Israel.
Look at what's going on the streets of Israel right now in terms of the families of those still being held, some of those who were released in recent weeks, some of those who know that their loved ones are already deceased. They have come out and told the lie to this as well. They have come out and said, Netanyahu, you've sabotaged this. You're the one that didn't conduct serious negotiations for a second phase. You've ended the ceasefire. You've endangered the hostages by resuming the war. The other thing that Israel has claimed which is, part of the deceit, is that they now are going after Hamas's civilian kind of Gaza governmental leadership. That's some of those. Obviously, the vast, overwhelming majority were civilians, children, as usual, back to committing the war crimes, which got us to where we are with the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. But some of those were the legal advisor, people who've been running some of the governmental affairs. And the lie there is that this is to prevent the resumption of Hamas governance. What we all know is that in the negotiations, Hamas has accepted that it will not be the governing party, but it will also not disarm and render itself non-existent in the context of continued belligerent, violent, illegal Israeli occupation. And so it's, and I'm sure the Western media will kind of do a he said, she said at best, but it's actually really transparent what has gone on here.
We can speak about this from a political standpoint. We can speak about what's happening in the back rooms and in the negotiating table, but ultimately what the real story is what's happening on the ground. Of course, what's happening in Gaza to the lives of the people that are shattered once again, the injured, the hospitals that are overflowing, this piece of land that has been denied humanitarian aid now for 2 weeks in the middle of Ramadan. But at the same time, there is a similar story. There is a similar group of people, as you mentioned, the hostage families, these people that have been waiting for 15 months for their loved ones to be returned, and now are being told that, no, the ceasefire is on hold now and we're not negotiating anymore. Is there, how significant is that in the context of Israeli public opinion, in the context of a prime minister who is now potentially asking his country to return back to the deployments and the draft and the reservists and the war that may continue for the foreseeable future?
I just want to pick up on one of those, which is why the direct American channel to Hamas was so threatening to Netanyahu. Now, let's give credit to, I think he's now been taken off the file because of this, to the envoy, Adam Boehler. This is exactly what anyone should have done, by the way. I give credit, but we're also just acknowledging how enabling of this continued horror, how complicit and how incompetent and pathetic the previous administration, by the way, and everyone else who's not part of being in the room with Hamas to try and resolve this. But when Boehler was in the room, he clearly heard things that he had been told previously weren't real. He comes out and says, you have to talk to them. We could get a 5 to 10 year truce. The biggest threat to Netanyahu was himself being exposed as the obstacle, as the naysayer. And when the envoy then starts telling the Israeli public on Israeli TV, that's not where Netanyahu wants to be. So number one, Netanyahu had to crush that. Number two, this really is a moment of deep division and polarization inside the Israeli public. The families of those being held are out on the streets. They know that those who are still alive can come out alive, that the person preventing that is Netanyahu. A fundamental social contract has been broken. Now, Netanyahu feels he can stare that down. Where the rubber hits the road, where we're really going to see that, is in the decision of whether or not to go in with ground forces. It's one thing to aerially bombard using the Israeli Air Force, kill, destroy. If Israel is going to seize territory, and I fear that in Gaza there will be an attempt this time to state as a war aim the indefinite control and depopulation of at least the north of Gaza. To do that, you need ground troops. To do that, you need reservists. You need people to show up. The press reports in Israel suggest that perhaps up to 50% are not positively responding to call-ups to do their reserve duty in recent months. And this is where when this is happening at the same time as the attempt to replace some of the senior echelons of the security services, like the head of the Shin Bet, the constitutional crisis that has set in motion, the fact that Israeli society, a part of it, is exhausted, is feeling some of the economic repercussions. I think the intersection, the interplay between that and ongoing Palestinian resistance and public resilience is going to be where this gets determined, unless something external becomes more decisive. Obviously, we're not seeing that from the US right now. We're seeing the permissive environment. We've seen the region step in with a plan, but we haven't seen the region step in and create costs for Israel. Some actors have tried to do that. And so as Israel returns to the more egregious committing of war crimes, those internal dynamics are also going to be impacted by the externalities, the kinds of things that we've seen the Hind Rajab Foundation do, holding individual Israelis who committed war crimes accountable, the efforts to say that there'll be no normal sport with an apartheid genocidal Israel, the attempts by states, those who launched the Hague Group, to at least push for the enforcement of international law, of the findings of the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice. I fear that those are on a trajectory which is too slow to impact this now, but that accountability is going to be an ever more important factor going forward. But right now, we're going to have to depend on that race between the polarization inside Israeli society and the ability of Palestinian society to show resilience. And that's going to be what will ultimately matter for Palestinians and Israelis alike.
You mentioned at the top of our conversation that this was not surprising, and I agree with you. I don't think anybody was surprised at what happened yesterday or the fact that it was going to happen. But do you think it was inevitable?
I don't really do inevitability. The odds were stacked in favor of that. The thing that could have prevented it in the current contours right now was if Netanyahu had felt that from the American perspective, he couldn't get away with this. Once he felt he could, I think, yes, that's when inevitability kicked in. I don't know whether some in Team Trump are thinking, you know what, let him have his fun, let him get his budget done. That's what he apparently most needs. We circle back to this. Let's see what happens in the Ukraine-Russia talks. We circle back to this, dreadful consequences, but these guys weren't going to be the human rights lawyers any more than Blinken and his genocide-enabling friends were going to be. But we could circle back to this. How good does Trump look if in a few weeks' time there's nothing happening but more war on the Ukraine-Russia front, and Gaza is in that bloodbath pace? I don't know how that will play out in either respect. But I don't think we've heard the last of this, as long as we are clear-headed in understanding that a Gaza ceasefire is hugely consequential. It could be something the Trump people return to, but they are not going to be the people who get us out of the broader malaise. Quite the opposite. They're going to be part of the choir cheering on that broader abrogation of Palestinian rights. But at the same time, this is an administration leading to massive, not in my lifetime, I don't think, geopolitical shifts, which also create opportunities. If you're South Africa, they're going after you because of what you've done on Israel and because they think that we want to go back to some kind of apartheid. You can't do stuff with white farmers. But if you're any other country in Africa, you're suddenly paying a huge cost for the abrupt closure of USAID. If you're Sudan, Somalia, Somaliland, apparently they're trying to get you to take Palestinians. And that's just one part of the world. In Africa, we are seeing a shifting geopolitics which, if the Palestinians have a leadership that know how to carry this forward, not the current leadership, obviously, that know how to work with these strategic changes, if those of us who care from a broader perspective are part of that effort, change can be there. Too late for the people who lost their lives overnight. Too late for those who are going to be impacted in the coming days. Too late for everyone who's been living this hell for almost a year and a half. But that's where the horizon of hope still lies.
Daniel Levy, you're always a voice of sanity in these times. We appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us once again.
Thank you. It's so good to talk to you. Take care.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture, and a big thank you to Daniel Levy for being our guest today. You can keep up to date with all of the latest developments in Gaza by following our live blog on middleeasteye.net. And as always, you can listen to this episode in audio format wherever you get your podcast from. And until next time, salam.
Our second and final report tonight features Chris Hedges, a longtime war correspondent and investigative journalist. He spoke on March 7th at the Sanctuary for Independent Media in Troy, New York. His talk was titled Normalizing Genocide and the New World Order. He asks how the world has changed since the genocide in Gaza, how we navigate a world now seemingly without rules or international law. And he counsels that the genocidal violence perpetrated in Gaza by the global North, sanctioned by the United States, paid for by the United States, and especially as the climate deepens, how this genocidal violence will be turned with ever more frequency in the future on the peoples of the global South. Here now is Chris Hedges. Thank you, as always, for watching. We'll see you soon. I'm Mark Hage, and this is The Report, Vermont Report on Palestine, Israel.